3 minutes in, I see that my students are here, and I also notice quite a few Macedonians. This is probably the most popular lecture that we've had. Looks like people are excited. Yeah, if people want to just kind of say hello in the chat, say where they're from and what they're doing, I think it would help Adam with calibration.
Yeah.
But assume that the target audience are beginning graduate students that are just starting with their research. So that's who we're giving it to. And then other people who are more experienced will probably be more opinionated as well.
All right.
Adam is on his phone. His computer is restarting. So eventually we'll get to slides, but I say we start with just a slow intro. Basically, I first heard about Adam when he published a research article that said things could be better. And I will share the link to it because I really thought this was the ideal way to communicate science. And he can tell us a little bit more about this work. And basically, I realized that his Substack is full of observations about psychology and the state of psychology, but also a lot about his personal experiences with academia, including an unforgettable stint at Oxford. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And then he also published a very impactful journal in Nature, which kind of went against his diatribe against peer review. He published in Nature, but he also complained that we shouldn't be peer reviewing articles. And I thought this is a beautiful topic to discuss in the class and hopefully learn more about Adam in the process. As far as I know, he has a degree in psychology. He was working in the business school at Columbia University and eventually decided to just leave Columbia and go his own way. So hopefully that's an inspirational story. And I would like to hear more from Adam, your life path, how you ended up where you are right now.
Cool. It says I've got 6 minutes remaining on my update. So for now, I'm going sans slides. But I'm really excited to be here. I appreciate the invitation. I'm excited to chat. Yeah, my name's Adam Mastroianni is how you say my last name in case it's an emergency. And
Is that the same as Adam Mastroianni, the actor?
Yes, actually, yeah.
You have a great last name.
I have a picture of my grandfather meeting him on a movie set. He was a movie reviewer, and I don't think we're actually related, but they found each other.
Wow.
Yeah. So that is my brush with fame, and I'm supposed to talk about peer review, and I will, but I want to begin by talking about research because I have realized inhabiting a place on the internet that the internet is full of professional science complainers, and I don't want to become one of them. And there are plenty of people who will tell you all the things that are terrible about science, and sometimes I agree with them, but I don't often trust them because I haven't seen that they actually care about the thing that we're trying to do. And I don't think you should trust anybody until you see that they care about the thing that you are trying to do. And so first I want to show you what I love to do, and then I want to show you how it's weird, and I want to raise the question to you of whether it should be weird. So to begin with the research, I'm going to talk first about that things could be better paper. And it just so happened that I was sitting one day with my friend Ethan, who's also a psychologist. We were eating omelets at a diner, and we got to talking about, like, why do people think that some things are better than other things? People say that people don't like our education system. They do like their phones. And we just thought that's it's weird that people do that. Or how do they do that? How do you look at a pizza and go, that's a good pizza? How do you look at a car and go, that's a good car or a bad car? How do you look at an actor and say it's a good actor or a bad actor? It seems just like the most obvious and easiest thing in the world that people do. But I, as a psychologist, don't really have a good explanation for how people do that. And we thought that one reasonable explanation might be that when you judge whether something is good or bad, what you're really doing is judging whether it is better or worse than some other thing. That maybe when you look at, say, a car, you have sort of this distribution in your mind of cars that go from very bad to very good or whatever. Maybe it's recruited in the moment specific to that car. And you go, well, if it's better than these cars and worse than those cars, it's a good car, not a great car. And we thought that might be a reasonable way for the mind to solve a problem like that. And we thought, well, if that's the case, then it should be that if it's easy for you to say how something could be better, that should be why you say it's good. or sorry, why you see it's bad. And if it's easy for you to say how something could be worse, that should be why you say it's good. All that seemed pretty reasonable to us. And so we started by trying to answer that question. And so we went on the internet and we wanted to get a bunch of targets, a bunch of things that people could say how they could be better or worse. And so we got a list of things that people think about on their everyday lives, just lists of nouns, organizations or institutions you interact with on a daily basis, things you think about on a daily basis. So we got this big list of nouns that people think about a lot, like your phone, like Amazon, YouTube, the economy, education, your toothbrush, from the mundane to the profound. Love is on the list. Your family is on the list, not your family specifically, but one's family. And so we took all of these nouns and then we asked people we got another sample of people and asked them to imagine how they could be different. So you see on the screen, like, how could cars be different? And you type out your answer, and then we pipe that answer back to you and say, okay, you said cars could be different in that, cars could fly. If that were to happen, how much better or worse would cars be? And people would tell us on a scale from -3 to +3. And when we put it all together, we saw that for every single item that we asked people about, they told us how it could be better. So when we asked about cars, they said, oh, they could be more fuel efficient. They could fly. They could not use gasoline. They could be more comfortable. They could be cheaper. When we asked about vacations you could take, they said they could be longer. They could be cheaper, right? I could be able to go to farther places faster. And this was true for all 52 items that we tested, even items that were already really good. So love is on the list. And when we asked people how could love be different, they said, oh, there could be more of it. It could be easier to find. It could not go away. And in fact, the highest, we also asked people, how good are these items right now? And the highest rated item currently on our list is pets. People love their pets. People love pets more than love itself, apparently. And when we asked people, how could pets be different? They said, well, they could not poop on the carpet so much. They could not shed. So even the things that people already thought were great, they thought about how they could be better, which, by the way, made no sense for our hypothesis, but we thought was pretty interesting. And so we wanted to follow it up.
Curious, what fraction of people actually suggested things that might be worse? Like, did anybody get that they could be doing things that things could be worse?
It's a great question. There's two ways to answer it. One is if you look at, so people did this for 6 items. If you look at their average across all items, what proportion of participants are on average doing this? And the answer is 90%. So very, very few people are going in the opposite direction, which for a psychology experiment is really weird, because even when we find effects on average, it's almost never 90%. I think even if you ran a study where you're like, would you rather get $5 or get like hit in the head with a frying pan? You'd still have like 15% of people who are like, oh, I don't know, frying pan sounds good. So it's like very odd to get that proportion of people. Another way of asking the question is, of all responses, what proportion were positive versus negative? Sorry, I don't have that statistic. What I do have is how many people gave at least one negative or way that things could be worse, and the answer is 51%. Okay. So people on almost every person does this on average. About half of people do it all of the time for every single item, and the other half of people do it at least the opposite, at least sometimes. So then we're like, okay, well, why are people doing this? Why, when we ask how things can be different, people always tell us something can be better? One possibility is people are just complaining. Except when you ask people, just people complaining in our study, but when you ask people how are things right now, they said most of the things are good. So when we ask about like love or cars or the education system, they actually said like they gave it higher ratings. There were a few things that people said were bad. So we had like coronavirus in the sample. People said that was bad. We had politics. People said that was bad. But even for those, people said how they could be better. Now my computer is online, so
before you switch, maybe you can just take a look at the chat. That way you get a feeling for the people that are on the call, and take a breather. Feel free to start the computer and continue with the slides when you're ready.
Cool. And I'm sorry for doing this. I was like, oh, it'd be good to have a refreshed computer for giving a talk on the internet, and my computer was like, hey, by the way, we haven't updated in about 2 years. So how about we do that right now?
Been there, done that. Very familiar.
Yeah.
So I'm just pasting the Slido code in here for the students. That way they can start asking the questions. Yeah, and while Adam is switching, how about we usually do recommendations? How about I do an anti-recommendation? I saw Oppenheimer and I just really, really, really didn't like it. But I mean, doesn't
Why didn't you
even
like
come
it? I'm
close.
interested.
Well, I mean, it was a difficult week I had last week, so like that could have something to do with it, but I thought it was just impenetrable movie making for no good reason, and I just thought the timelines were too mixed. I thought the dialogue was too heavy. The sound score was so aggressive that every replica was emphasized by very strong music, and it just felt more important than it really convinced me to be. So anyway, it's good performance, but I really came out of it being more confused about the Manhattan Project than before going in. And I think it's just Nolan doing too much and every subsequent movie just becoming more and more complicated. So anyway, I can share some recommendations from the people in the Slido, but that's my anti-recommendation for the week. Anybody have a strong opinion on that wants to reply with? Did you see it, Adam?
I did. I didn't. I also didn't care for it. I think in part because it feels like the way that we depict scientists in movies is like their brain is totally different. Inside their brain is like flashes of electrons, and it feels like it others them, that it's like they just think differently than anyone ever could, and we cannot possibly understand what it's like to be them. But the whole point of watching a movie is to, I think, try to understand what it's like to be someone. I also thought that it was a lot of people talking and not a lot of people doing. And so there are parts
Mhm.
where it's like, Oppenheimer, you're so good at persuading people, but we've never seen him persuade anybody of anything at that point in the movie. And like the whole point of a movie is to show people doing things, so you don't have to tell me about them. Just show me doing something, and I'll believe you. And then I thought it sidestepped the most interesting question, which is like, what is it like for this guy to create this bomb that kills so many people? And like they did that at a little bit, but the most interesting part is when when Germany surrenders and they have to decide whether to keep making it. And he goes like, "Well, I guess we should," and then they do. But like that, you could have made a whole movie about that moment. Um,
No, I agree. I found the whole Robert Downey Jr. subplot kind of anticlimactic. Sure, they screwed him over, but he got his recognition and the movie could have been an hour shorter if we didn't deal with that. So yeah, I see what you're saying. And
yeah,
Jana, was it you that recommended it? Is that why you put in the chat you're not recommending anything ever?
Yep.
No, don't worry. I would have seen it regardless. I mean, I am a Nolan fan, but early Nolan more than late Nolan, I
He
guess.
did overdo it this time, but the idea behind it was good at least.
Yeah, I mean, it was well made, but again, 3 hours. If it was an hour and a half, I would have forgiven more. So, Adam, anyway, that's the intermission. So
all
looks
right,
like you see your slides. So feel free
cool.
to continue.
Cool. So this is how amazing the talk would have looked if I had slides from the beginning. Look, there was a car, there was a pizza. Tom Hanks was there. This is how I was going to illustrate the thing. Like, what if you have a distribution of cars in your head, and
You
you
have
go,
a
"Oh, this one's
Yugo.
better
Is that a
than the
Yugo?
worst ones." Is it? This is a Honda Civic.
Ah,
Oh,
okay, the
oh,
second
on the
one.
on the bottom row.
Yeah. Anyway, that's our
Oh, I don't know. I
Yugoslavian
just
car.
looked. It's the result of a Google search for beat up car.
I think that's a Yugo. That's our Yugoslavian car. I used to drive one of those.
Um, Maybe it was that one. And then if we do think about how good or bad things are based on our ability to think about them being different, maybe that's why it's difficult for you to tell me whether this is a good or bad Starbelly Sneech machine, because you have no reference for what a Starbelly Sneech machine does or what it should do. And so if I ask you, is this a good one? You tell me, I don't know. So this is the study I told you about before. We asked people to list a bunch of things. We got a bunch of items, from the mundane to the profound. And then the point that I was at was we asked people to tell us how those things could be different. They tell us, and then we ask them if it were different in that way, how much better or worse would it be? And here are the averages for all of those items. So what I'm calling valence is just how much better or worse would it be. And on the x-axis is all of those 52 items. And as you can see, on average, people tell us how all of them could be better, even though they say most of those things are good right now. So this is the rating that people gave to the items as they currently are. There's pets at the top of the list. There's politics and coronavirus at the bottom. But it didn't seem to really matter. It was the case that the worse the item was, the more people said it could be better. But even the best ones, people said it could be better. Like I said, 90% of participants showed this effect. So rather than averaging by item, it's averaging by participant. There are a few people who go the opposite way, but by and large, pretty much everybody is above that line. Okay, so now why? Why do people do this? Could have been that they were just complaining, except they're happy to say things are currently good. And if you're complaining, wouldn't you say like, oh, cars are bad? Another possibility is it's an optimism bias. So I'm a psychologist, and so we know that there's this bias toward optimism, that people think that good things are going to happen to them more than bad things. People think they're less likely than average to like break a bone or something. But I think there is some optimism bias here. When we ask people how likely these things are, they did say that the better things were more likely to happen, but not that they were likely overall. That on the most common likelihood of one of these ways that things could be better was 0%. So saying that cars could fly but probably won't, it doesn't exactly strike me as optimistic. So it doesn't seem that this is just people going like, oh, everything is going to be good. They're thinking about how things can be good, but may not ultimately be good. But another obvious possibility is that when we ask people about different, it just sounds to them like we're asking the question, how could it be better? Except for the fact that half of participants think of at least one way that things could be worse. So it's kind of odd if everybody thinks this question, how could things be different, is the question, how could things be better? But then sometimes they answer a different question. But still, it's possible. So we ran another study where we were like, okay, tell us what you think this question means. And we asked people, if we asked you, how could things be different? What do you think we want from you? Do you think we want you to say how things could be better, or a mix of better and worse, or will you have no assumption, or are you not sure? And it did turn out that when we asked people, what do you think we mean by the question, how could things be different? A majority of them said, I think you mean, how could things be better? So we're like, okay, great. What if we asked you, how could things be better or worse? And we asked this to a separate group of people, so they're not comparing the two questions. And those people told us, oh, I think you want a mix of better and worse. And the same thing if we ask, how could things be worse or better? People think that question means, oh, you want me to give you a mix of ways that things could be better or worse. So we thought, okay, great. We can just change the question to how could things be better or worse. Now people don't interpret it as meaning how could things just be better. And so let's see if that changes the effect. That's just what we did. We got another set of participants. We do exactly the same thing. We show you a thing, ask you how it could be better or worse or better rather than different. And it made no difference. So again, valence is how much better or worse could things be. Doesn't matter really whether we ask how could things be better or worse, or how could things be worse or better. People tell us how things could be better. And in fact, it's pretty much the same effect that we got in study one. So people do this a little bit less if you ask worse or better, but pretty much the same thing. And again, for every single item. So it didn't matter whether it was the news, that could be better. School could be better. Sports could be better. Music could be better. Your microwave could be better. So we thought, okay, it doesn't really seem to be about just asking a question that people interpret a certain way. Does this only happen in like weird online studies where people get asked dumb questions, like how could things be different? Or do people do this on their own? We got another set of people and we just asked them, can you list 5 thoughts that you had recently and they were about how something could be better or worse? And then we asked them, okay, was this a thought about how something could be better or worse? Or just neutrally different if you weren't really following the instructions. And again, people thought about how things could be better. They said, I did have a thought about how things could be better or worse, and the thought was about how things could be better. I'll even show you a grid for each of the thoughts that people reported. Only 4% of them were about how things could be different in some neutral way. 29% of them were about how something could be worse. And fully 2/3 of them were about how something could be better. So this doesn't seem to be just something that people do only when a psychologist is asking them a stupid question on the internet. People seem to be doing this in their everyday lives. They're thinking about how things could be better. But then we want to know, okay, well, are there some kind of people who do this more than others? I mean, we have 90% of people doing this, but maybe some people are really driving the effect. And we thought that that maybe the people doing this a lot might be people who experience more depression or anxiety. That it might be that what it means to have depression or anxiety is to always be thinking either about how things could be better, and that makes you feel like things are really bad right now, or about how things could be worse, that makes you feel really worried. So we had people do the same procedure as before, and then fill out measures of anxiety and depression and some personality measures. And we found exactly the same results as we did before. So we just replicate our effect. When we look at whether depression makes any difference in the answers that people give, so people's depression score is on the x-axis. Again, on the y-axis is how much better or worse things could be. It makes no difference. So people who score really high on the depression scale give the same kind of answers as people who score really low on the depression scale. So that doesn't seem to matter. Same thing for anxiety. People who score really high on the anxiety scale give the same kind of answers as people who score really low on the anxiety scale. So that hypothesis was out the window. When we administered a sort of standard psychological personality test, the Big Five, to people, we did find that people who report being more open to experience are more likely to say that things could be better. The other personality traits didn't seem to matter, being agreeable or conscientiousness or extroverted or neurotic, which I thought was weird. We thought neurotic would have done this, that if you are always thinking about how bad things are, shouldn't you be either thinking way more about how things could be better or way more about how things could be worse? No, didn't make any difference. I don't know what to make of this thing where more open people say that things could be better more. Maybe it means nothing, or it means something that I haven't divined yet. If you have ideas, I'd be happy to hear them. And then we thought, okay, so we can't really find an obvious group of people who, for some obvious reason, do this more than others. And so we don't have a great explanation of why people are doing this. Maybe it's still possible, though, that this is just a thing that like Americans do, or just Westerners do. And so we wanted to know, is this just like American culture where we're like, oh, things could always be better. That's the American dream. And so we wanted some people who weren't Americans. And we started by getting some people from Poland who just happened to be easier to get online. There's a website where there's a good number of Polish people ready to take studies. And so we got a sample of them. We have 95 of them. All these participants were people who were Polish nationals that are born in Poland, currently living in Poland. They're native Polish speakers, but they're also fluent in English. So they are a little bit weird, but clearly different from the American sample that we've had so far. And once again, we find that for every single item, they report on average how it could be better. There are a few that are nearer the midpoint, like weather and watches. We don't really know, could be noise, but it didn't seem like there was some obvious difference in how much people do this when we move to a different cultural context. Then we thought, like, okay, well, they're still answering in English, right? And so it could be that the way that you answer this question in English is really what drives the way people respond to it. And so we wanted to get a new sample of people who aren't Americans and aren't answering in English. And so we got a sample of people in China. So we, again, just asked people how things could be different or worse or better. We did this with 307 people who were all Chinese nationals who were living in China, fluent in Mandarin, and they are responding in Mandarin. Now, translating it to a Chinese context meant that we had to remove some items that are more sensitive in a Chinese context. Like, we didn't want to ask people in China how the government could be different. The person helping us with translation said that this may be not the best question to ask. And there are some things that don't make a lot of sense in China, like Google there is blocked, so we changed it to Baidu. But otherwise, we're dealing with pretty much the same list of items. And once again, we find that for every single item, they tell us how it could be better. The items I've shown you are the English equivalents. But here too, we find that everything from love to your stove, when we ask people how it could be different, how it could be better or worse, or how it could be worse or better, people tell us it could be better. So we said, okay, this doesn't seem to be due to like answering in English, doesn't seem to be about the way the question is asked, it doesn't seem to be about being American or being a certain kind of person. And then we ran study 8. And I wish I could tell you why we ran study 8, but I forgot why we ran study 8. I texted Ethan, my friend who was working with me on this project, and he texted back, "Bro, I don't even remember running this one." So, as sometimes happens when you are running a scientific project, sometimes you like go do something else for a while. And so this was kind of the back burner for a bit. When we came back to write it up, I remembered thinking that like, oh yeah, study 8 really nails it. And then when I went back, I was like, wait, I forgot how we reasoned ourselves into running study 8. Nevertheless, all of our studies are pre-registered, and really I just copy and paste the data analysis code from each study to the next. So we knew exactly what we did, but we just forgot why we did it. Which goes to show you should keep notes, but I didn't. So here you go. That said, I think the results of study 8 are interesting. I just kind of forgot why we did it. What we did was we randomly assigned people to either list how each of 6 items could be better, or how they could be worse, or how they could be different. So each participant is doing a study where they're either always saying how things could be better, or they're always saying how things could be worse, or they're always saying how things could be different. And what we want them to do is list as many as they can in 40 seconds, and we pay them extra money if they list more. So they're motivated to list as many as they can. And what we want to know is just how many do they list in that period of time. And so what's on the y-axis now is the count of how many items people thought of, or how many ways things could be better, different, or worse. And actually, when you ask people to list how ways things could be different or ways that things could be worse, they do better. They get more items, not by a lot, but by a little bit, than if you ask them how things could be better. Which suggests that like, and this is why I think study 8 is helpful, not why I think we ran it in the first place, but I don't think it's just like easier to think how things could be better, because obviously when people were under time pressure and paid to do this, they got farther when they thought about how things could be worse. So it doesn't suggest that people were just answering our questions in the way that was easiest for them. I think there's something else going on. So to summarize what we found, when you ask people how things can be different, they tell you how they could be better. It doesn't seem to matter. The pragmatics of the question don't seem to explain it. It happens in people's everyday thoughts. Pretty much everyone in our studies does it. Polish people do it too. So do Chinese people answering in Mandarin. But it is actually easier to think of ways that things could be worse or just different. So like, why do people do this? Why does it happen? I don't know. I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that question. It could be that maybe this is a good way of solving problems, right? That maybe on average, we humans survive because it's more useful to think about ways that things could be better and make that happen than it is to think about ways that things could be worse and prevent that from happening. Perhaps we are the descendants of people who had this general tendency, and maybe it helped them survive. And that's why we're here. Maybe, I have no idea, but it would make sense. I do think it could also potentially explain what we psychologists call the hedonic treadmill, which is just a phenomenon where once you are kind of happy, it's really hard to get happier. And I don't think we have a great explanation for why that's the case. And this may be one of the cognitive mechanisms behind that, that even as your life gets better, even if you're always thinking about how things could be better, you're never going to feel better, right? When you move from a crappy apartment to a nice house, you used to think about, wouldn't it be nice if I lived in a nice house? Once you're in a nice house, you're thinking about, oh, wouldn't it be nice to live in a nicer house? Then when you get a nicer house, you're thinking about, oh, wouldn't it be nicer to have 2 houses? And then when you have 2 houses, you're thinking of like, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have a hot tub in my second house? And so if you have this tendency, maybe this is why it's difficult to get happier. Okay, that's the research. And then we tried to do what you usually do when you do some research, which is you try to write it up and send it to a journal. And so Ethan and I sat down and we tried to write this up for a journal, but it sucked. Like it sucked. It was hard, and it was hard for a few reasons. One was there were obvious connections to existing literature, like that story I told you about, sitting at a diner and eating omelets and talking about why do people think things could be better or worse. That's where the idea came from. Like it wasn't that we read a bunch of papers and we're like, aha, a gap in the literature, like time to fill it. I mean, we looked for other explanations that people had published. We didn't really think that there was one out there. But so it made it really hard to write the introduction of a paper where you're supposed to be like, here are the 100 people who have ever said anything at all related to this. We just didn't think there were that many of them. We also set out to test an idea and then ended up doing something else. Like this whole thing about like, why do people say some things are good and bad? All of these studies like don't end up answering that question. Like they're just chasing down this weird thing that people seem to keep doing. And this is hard to explain in a scientific paper where you kind of look silly. If you say that, like it makes it harder to get it published. I forgot why we ran study 8, which is also embarrassing. And I really tried, and I still have the draft on my computer. I tried to write a version of this where I don't lie about the fact that I forgot how I ran study 8, but I don't say that we know why we did it. After the end of study 7, we go, and now one might expect that it would be easier to list lots of ways that things could be better. And so let's see in another study. It felt bad. It felt bad to write that. We also don't really know why this effect happens. Like, I want to tell people about it because I think it's weird. It's strange that people do this all over the world for every single item, even if when you change the question. But I don't have a great explanation for why it happens, and I might not for a while. And it was hard to explain all of this in a paper without lying, or without at least dissembling, right? Like, not full on lying, but not communicating in a way that I was proud of. And then really, I think the main sin of this paper that we were trying to write was that it was just boring. I had so much fun running all those studies, even though I forgot why we ran one of them. And yet when I tried to put it in paper form, it felt like dead and stupid. And so as Ethan and I were struggling with it one day, we were just like, what if we just told the truth? Like, what if we just wrote this honestly? And what if we wrote the version of this paper that was fun and made us feel proud? And so that's what we did. We just wrote it up in honest language about what we did. We hid nothing. And I mean, all these studies were already pre-registered. All the data is on the internet, and all the code and all the materials. Like, we don't have anything to hide. I want people to know what we did, because I want people to understand it, and I want people to help me understand it. And so we wrote this thing that we put on SciArchive, which is what psychologists use to just post PDFs of their papers. Usually what they use this for is, I've submitted my paper to a journal and I want people to know that I have claimed this idea, and so I'm going to put it out here first. Or I just want to, get the word out first. But I mean, anybody can upload a PDF to this. Like, there's no like guard at the door asking, like, making sure you're a psychologist or even a scientist or whatever. And so we wrote this paper that, begins, some scientists get their ideas while beholding the wonders of the cosmos. Some scientists get their ideas while cutting their way through the Amazon with a machete. I get my scientific ideas while eating omelets with my friend Ethan. And like, writing this paper was so fun. It was so easy. Usually finishing the paper it's so long and it's such a pain. And those of you who've done this know this, right? That like, that last 20% is as bad as the first 80%. This last 20% was awesome. I loved it. And it made me feel good. I felt like I was being myself. And I had written other papers for journals before this. And when they came out, what I felt was relief. It wasn't joy. And when I look back at them, what I feel is relief. It's not pride. Like, those papers don't make me feel anything anymore. I'm proud of the research that I did, but not necessarily the paper that I produced. This is one when I look back, it makes me feel proud. I'm glad that I did this. And I'm glad that I did this, even though it was a silly thing to do. That you don't get credit as a scientist for putting PDFs on the internet. You get credit for putting papers in journals. And so I knew that, like, this was kind of like burning a pile of money. Right? That, like, I wasn't going to advance in my career for doing this. But at this point, I didn't care, because I felt like I was doing the right thing. And that's why I did it. It was its own reward. But then a bunch of other rewards came. So what I knew at the time, but had also forgotten, much like I'd forgotten why we ran study 8, is that there's a Twitter bot that tweets out anytime someone uploads a PDF to SciArchive. And I knew this bot existed because I follow it, but I'd kind of forgotten that this was going to happen. What I was going to do was put this on SciArchive so that there's like a persistent PDF version of it, and then I was going to put it on my blog the next day, which at the time had like 10,000 words or something. And so I was going to push it out to them all the next day. And so I uploaded it at 5:17 p.m. Ate dinner, went to sleep, and then I woke up in the morning to find that thousands of people had read it. And because they had found this tweet, like a tweet by a robot, had people had picked this up, like, because usually the SciArchive bot tweets out things like, the mediated moderated relationship between self-affirmation and system justification theory, a revision or something. And people saw this like paper called Things Could Be Better, and they're like, what? And then they started reading it, they're like, what? And so I woke up to tweet like this. And this was like frightening because I didn't think that anyone was going to see this, at least not yet. But it was also heartwarming that like all these people were saying that this was good. And I wish I could find this tweet now. I can't. But someone tweeted something like, "I read this to my 8-year-old daughter this morning, and she understood it." And I was like, "Yes, that's the thing that I want to do. Why wouldn't I want to produce a paper that could be understood by an 8-year-old?" I mean, I don't know. Sometimes like there might be math or something like, yeah, you just have to spend a long time on like understanding it before you can get it. But not my stuff. My stuff's dumb. Like I ask people how things could be different. Like anybody can understand that. There's no reason to express this idea in any other way than an 8-year-old could understand. And I thought, maybe the 8-year-old like ends up being the person who like understands why this happens. Or even if not, like she can go do whatever. I want her to understand how science works, because whether she ends up doing science or not, she's going to live in a world that's shaped by science. She's going to have to make decisions based on science or like scientific evidence. It's like, why? Like, I want her to know what I did. And so not only that, but this ended up getting so much attention that, just to put this in context, like the papers that I had published previous to this, which are in PNAS, which is widely considered like a very prestigious journal. This paper, this stupid paper, that had dumb jokes in it and like admitted that I forgot why I read stuff. It has been viewed as many times as those papers combined. And those are in journals that like that journal has like a big mailing list, right? Like people read it. People read that on their own. And if you include like the views from my blog, this is viewed way more than both of those papers combined. Which also means we got great feedback. So people sent us like annotated PDFs and long emails. Not just psychologists too, biologists actually gave me the most in-depth feedback. They also left us comments, they tweeted at us. Tons of people messaged me with guesses as to like why we ran study 8. And so we revised the paper in light of people's comments. Like for instance, one that biologist was like, these graphs that with depression and anxiety, I actually think would show your effect better if you reverse the X and the Y axes. I was like, yeah, actually you're right. And so I just like changed the graphs, re-uploaded a new version. The reviews we got were more thorough and more helpful than I'd ever gotten from a journal. And so at the bottom of the paper, you can also see, I thank all the people who gave us helpful comments. And some of them are people who have like real names. And some that you can see, like there's a person named Bash on there. There's a person named Arbitrum. These are just anonymous people on the internet who wanted to help. And their comments were so much better because they wanted to help, right? Usually the comments you get from a reviewer, like maybe they're a good soul and they want to help you, but often the way that they are thinking about your paper is, should I open the gate for it or not? Which is different from wanting to help you or not. Okay, so that's what I do. That's what I love to do. And I want to circle back to one of the questions that one of the tweeters raised, which was, why don't we write papers this way? I write up all my studies if I could just write in layperson honesty, so easy to understand and fun to read. Yeah, why? Why don't we do this? Like, why was this a weird thing to do? Like, it felt weird to me at the time. It felt like a stupid thing to do at the time. Like, why? And to understand that, I think we need a conceptual framework that, to me, makes this make a lot more sense. That in the world, there are strong link problems and weak link problems.
So Adam, maybe this is a good point to take a break. I don't know how you're doing with time, so we're not rushed. But I'd like us to, ask questions about this study before we proceed with kind of the big picture. And I feel you. I actually got a PhD from Stanford without publishing a single journal article for very much the same reasons. And fortunately, I had the support of my supervisor. So basically, when I asked him if I should write a paper, he said, calculate the opportunity cost. And basically the opportunity cost was not doing the work I actually wanted to do. So I was able to, get a career going despite not writing papers. And it's nice to see this kind of, repeating and other people realizing that it's possible to do so. There's a couple of questions in the chat, but my main question, something that I've wanted to ask you, I never got a chance. What about the costs of doing this research? Like, if you collected, your time, your colleagues' time, the Amazon Turk payments, how much did it cost you to put this out?
Good question. Okay, so in terms of payments, I think this was probably all told a few $1,000s. The most expensive part being recruiting the sample of participants in China, because we had to like pay a recruiting company to do that. So $1,000. In terms of time, it's really hard to know. I mean, I can give it comparatively, right? That like when it actually came time to write the paper, like the time spent making this version of the paper, I would think it took like 25% as much as the time it would have taken to like write the version of this paper that would have been journal ready. And that's not even considering the time that like it would spend being reviewed and the time that we would spend responding to those reviews and like writing the responses to reviewers and going through multiple rounds of that. Running the actual studies actually goes pretty fast, right? Like we would get data back in an afternoon when we posted it on mTurk. It did take a lot of time, like programming the studies with like each of those items. Yeah, so I can't give a very precise answer. I could tell you like less than if I did it the normal way.
Right. And tell me, how are you with time, by the way? Is there a time when we have
I'm good.
You're good. So there's a question from Kirill in the chat, and then maybe Rosita afterwards. Kirill, do you want to ask it, or should I read it?
Yeah, I can ask it. Thank you, Nico.
Yeah, go ahead. Maybe yourself as well.
Okay, so I'm sorry, my camera is not working, so I'm gonna have to be a black box today. My question is regarding this. So I really like work where, you know, people put the scientific work out there, and then the community decides whether or not it's worth it publicly by reviewing it all really online. So I have a few examples. So there's from the world of AI, there's you may have heard of Geoff Hinton, which is one of the godfathers of AI. That's how the media calls him. He's at the University of Montreal. So he published one, for instance, paper that was hugely influential in machine learning, which is called knowledge distillation. Without getting into technical details, this paper now is cited like 15,000 times, have shifted tremendously how machine learning people do their work, and it was never published on a peer-reviewed journal or a conference. It was just an archive paper. And now the thing is, though, the very fact that it was cited by 15,000 other papers should be good enough that the paper should not waste anyone's time to do reviewing. That's one thing. Another thing is, okay, we have an idea. Not many of us have that kind of reach, right? Geoff Hinton, if he puts something on archive, everybody's going to read it. If I put something on archive, my friends in the library are going to read it, and maybe not even them. And so then I cannot play this game. So what can I do then in that case, or more junior people who starting their PhDs? So there's one other option. I don't know if you heard about open review, where you can put your paper and you can even decide whether or not you want to be anonymous. You can even be anonymous if you want to. And then you can reveal the identity afterwards. And so on open review, you put the paper pretty much like you do on archive. But the difference there is you can also have reviews there. And so anybody can write a review on your paper. So this is what Jan LeCun did, another machine learning person. He made some crazy theory about how the new generation of neural architecture should look like for machine learning. Instead of putting it on archive, he put it on open review, and he said, open season, please attack the idea. And then, of course, because he's also famous, I don't know, many people wrote there, and he was adjusting the paper as he was going, pretty much like you are doing. So I'm wondering if open review is the way to go instead of doing like official peer review on the one hand, and on the other hand, if you don't have the outreach, or if you don't know people, or if you simply don't attract attention for your idea, what does that mean then? Should your idea just die, or how do you battle against people not caring enough to actually provide the review? So I'm curious on your thoughts on these two opposites.
Yeah, I think taking a lot of different approaches is good. So like, I would never be like everybody should do exactly what I do. Like this was good for me because like I liked doing it, like it aligned with my values. I don't think everybody would enjoy this. However, I do think that I mean, the reason I include this whole story about like the SciArchive bot is that like I wasn't famous. I don't think I am now. But I had like even less reach then. Like the reason people learned about this was because of a Twitter bot, and like because then also the paper like looked weird. Like that is what got people interested in the place, rather than like having to be famous, having a large reach. Which just means that like that happens all the time, but it doesn't mean that that's possible. That like it is possible to like get your work in front of other people, but it maybe requires doing the things that like seem silly. That like I think we're all trying to compete in the same way, and so like if you write a paper in the way that everybody writes papers, like why should anybody pay more attention to your paper than some other paper? Everybody's going to look for the signal that like I should pay more attention to this paper, and that signal is usually going to be either you have a big name already or the paper is in a big journal. Although I think also like the question of how to reach people is maybe misspecified. That like I like that a lot of people read this paper, but actually scientifically I don't need thousands of people to read it. I need a few of the right people to read it. And so I'm glad that like one consequence of many people reading it is the right people read it. But there may actually only be like 5 people in the world for whom it is really important for this idea that they encounter it. And everyone else is gravy. And I think you get that from like talking to those people and forming those connections. And you don't necessarily have to get it by like going viral on Twitter. That I would hate that like the only way that a paper succeeds is by going viral. That I think there are a lot of ideas that like need to succeed much more locally than that. And so I don't think like we should even try to optimize for like getting as many eyeballs as possible instead of like trying to get the right eyeballs. I also think that like if you do something that is undeniably useful, I do think it has a way of getting out there. I mean, that like superconductor story from a few weeks ago being one version of it, right? Like a lot of people saw that like this is really big if true, and so a lot of people tried to figure out, is it true? And turns out like, okay, no. But like if you invent a perpetual motion machine and can prove that it's a perpetual motion machine, like people will eventually notice because your work is going to be so useful. This isn't the case for a lot of work which is like less useful than that, which is also fine work to do. But I think like the most useful ideas tend to have a way of escaping eventually.
Thank you. Thanks, Adam. So Rosita raised a hand. By the way, I asked Kirill to introduce himself. He's a researcher at NEC Labs in AI and one of the founders of this mailing list of Macedonian researchers. Rosita, she's a colleague back from the Stanford days. Rosita, do you hear us?
Muted. Sorry, I was muted. Adam, thank you very much for the thought-provoking presentation, and also this topic of peer reviewing, you know, the whole stress around it is very prominent and relevant for the discussion. But I'm just, my question to you is, why are you so profoundly skeptical that people want to give you good feedback? Because, for instance, if I would be asked to review this article, you know, I would suggest many things. I would probably make it major reviews without acceptance, you know, but my intention would be very, let's say, good intentional to help you improve it, because you need to consider intellectual kind of approach that is different from your numerical kind of statistical quantitative approach. You need to engage philosophy in terms of, you know, metaphor, metonymy of language, Bakhtin, you know, Baudrillard. You need to really make a stretch in terms of how to define the field of communication and how language functions and operates in that. So then as a social anthropologist, I would say, if you would have done this as a qualitative study with only 5 people, you know, selecting them according different criteria, but spending a long-term research time with them, 1 year, you would discover that it's silences that matter. things that are unsayable, where words fail. And so I'm just thinking you could do endless surveys like this, but the result would be again the same in terms of exercise of nominations, labeling, terminology that doesn't really give you a proper insight into the day-to-day relationship of how language, labels, emotions, feelings, fantasies function. So I would, instruct you or advise you to pay attention to that, or maybe bring this in the introduction in terms of backing up or explaining or displaying knowledge that you're aware of the philosophical dimension, of the anthropological, or the silences and places where words fail. So I'm just curious to hear you. Why are you so profoundly distrustful about the reviews and the good intention that people could give you?
Yeah, part of it is from experience. As I've had papers reviewed in the formal way, I've had some that were helpful. I've had some more that were hostile, to the point where I've had people tell me that like my paper is too fun, and there wasn't this paper. This was a way less fun paper, where like we had a somewhat jaunty example. Like it wasn't even a joke, and like it wasn't at all inappropriate. It was just a little bit silly. And they were like, I don't think that's appropriate for scientific communication. Whatever, that's a fine opinion for people to have. And I am perfectly happy to receive that piece of feedback. I'm not happy to receive that piece of feedback under threat, right? Of not having my research transmitted to other people. And this is, I think, the difference, that when you receive reviews from people who are thinking about whether they should open the gate for your paper or not, they're in a different mindset. They're in a mindset of evaluation rather than feedback. And I think there are good-hearted people out there who can overcome that mindset and still give you good feedback. But I think that situation is pretty powerful, and people's incentives are pretty strong to look at research very cynically, rather than just skeptically. And so I would rather get feedback from people who are interested in what I'm doing and want to help me do it better, rather than people who are talking to me because they feel like they have some professional obligation to man the gates and decide which things should get in or out. So for instance, the way you phrased it was that I need to do certain things. And I'm happy to receive that feedback, right? But I might disagree. I might disagree on what I need to do. And what I want is to preserve my freedom to decide which of those things I take into account and which I don't, and to have my ideas live or die based on those consequences, right? Like maybe if I continue doing this the wrong way, like this turns out not to be useful to people, and then no one uses my idea. And maybe if I took your feedback, maybe people would. But I want that freedom to take that responsibility one way or the other, rather than have it imposed on me. So the short answer is I'm skeptical in part from experience.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And I think this is the perfect segue to the second part of your presentation. So maybe, we can continue the discussion after you wrap up the slides.
Cool. No, my slide disappeared. Let me reshare again.
Maybe it moved it to another display.
Yeah, it must have.
You can also choose for Zoom to only share the window that you want to share, and then it's probably going to focus well. Yep, that works.
Now it says my screen sharing is paused.
Huh. I saw the slide briefly, and now it's blank. Or
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's try that one more time.
Should be good now.
Okay, now we good? Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so I think, especially in light of Rosita's question, it is helpful to have this framework of strong link and weak link problems, because I think it also explains some of our attitudes toward peer review. So I think you can usefully divide many problems in the world into strong link and weak link. A weak link problem is a problem in which you succeed by making the worst things better. So for instance, food safety in a grocery store is a weak link problem, because you don't care how safe the safest food is. You care how safe the least safe food is, right? If I tell you that in your local grocery store, there is an item that if you ingest it will kill you, you don't want to shop there. Even if I tell you, well, actually, all the other ones are really, really safe. You're like, yes, but it really matters how dangerous the most dangerous thing is. So in this situation, you would pay a lot of money. You would much prefer to make the most dangerous things safer than to make the safest things safer. And actually, most situations that have to deal with safety are weak link problems like this, where you want to find the places that are the most dangerous and make them less so. But not all problems are like this. Some problems are strong link problems, where you succeed by making the best things better. So for instance, if you are an Olympic coach and you want your team to win a gold medal, you don't care about making your slowest runners faster. There's no benefit in going from 30th place to 25th place. You get a medal if you go from 5th place to 1st place. You want to make your fastest runners faster. You are in a strong link problem. One way of visualizing the difference between these is if you have a bunch of things with variance on either side. In a strong link problem, you care a lot about the upside variance, all those outliers on the good side. You want more of those. In a weak link problem, you care a lot about the outliers at the lower side. You want to get rid of those. And the reason why it is so important to separate these two kinds of problems is because they require opposite solutions. When you have a strong link problem, you want to increase outliers or have more variance or more weirdness, because you will benefit from having more of the very best things. But if you're in a weak link problem, you want to decrease outliers or variance or weirdness, because you'll be harmed by having more of the very bad things. In a strong link problem, you don't want gatekeeping, because you might actually accidentally keep the best out. But in a weak link problem, you do want gatekeeping, because you'll keep the worst out. In a strong link problem, you want to ignore the worst. In a weak link problem, you improve the worst. In a strong link problem, you improve the best. In a weak link problem, you ignore the best. In a strong link problem, you want to accept risk because the downside doesn't matter. And in a weak link problem, you want to avoid risk because the downside is all that matters. So this is why having this framework, I think, is really helpful, because the way that you approach these two problems is opposite in many cases. The important thing is that science is a strong link problem. We proceed at the rate that we do our best work, not at the rate that we improve our worst work. We benefit much more from producing more of our best discoveries than from making our worst discoveries somewhat better. Let me give you a historical example that I think illustrates this well. You probably know this guy, Isaac Newton, legendary scientist. You know him because of his work on mechanics and optics, the laws of motion, which turned out to still be useful today. You don't know him for his work on a recipe for the Philosopher's Stone. And it turns out that like one of these things survived and one of these things didn't in the long term. And like, why is it? Like, why did one stick around and the other did not? It has to be because one was true and the other wasn't. You cannot use his recipe for a Philosopher's Stone to make a Philosopher's Stone. It turns out that we are unable to use alchemy to turn other elements into gold, but we are able to use the laws of motion to, for instance, land on the moon. That's why those survived. The untrue ones eventually fell away. But it took a long time. In Newton's day, these were both completely reasonable projects to work on. And in fact, for 100 years after he did his work on in alchemy, it would still be completely reasonable to work on the Philosopher's Stone. So it wasn't even clear at the time which of these was important. It was only clear with the benefit of hundreds of years which ones turned out to stick around. And I think they stick around because the truth is more powerful than falsehood. You can do things with the truth that you cannot do with falsehoods. And I think if you're a scientist, if you believe that there is a truth to discover, I think you have to believe this, that the truth ends up being more useful than things that aren't true. The unfortunate thing is that we treat science like it's a weak link problem. And one of the main ways that we do this is what we call peer review, or universal pre-publication peer review, which I assume most people are familiar with it, but in case anyone hasn't done this process yet, when you work in science, when you do your research, like I described in the first part of the talk, the next thing you do is you write it up and you send it to a journal. And what happens is there's an editor there who can decide to reject it right there, in which case you go to another journal, or it never comes out. Or they can choose to send it out to anonymous reviewers, usually about 3 of them, who will send you both feedback and a recommendation as to whether the paper should be published or not, which the editor will ultimately decide. Different journals work slightly differently, but that's in general how the system works. When we talk about universal pre-publication peer review, there are 2 components to it that I want to separate. One is feedback and the other is gatekeeping. The feedback part is ancient. We've been doing that forever, giving each other feedback on our ideas. I also think it's good. I don't think anyone has a reasonable argument against people giving each other feedback. It's the gatekeeping part that is both new and it's quite costly, and I will at least argue is bad. So first, it's new. Universal scientific gatekeeping is historically weird. For most of history, scientific communication has been a hodgepodge, that when you were someone who discovered something about the world, the way that you communicated it was much more varied than it is now. You might write a letter, you might publish a manuscript, you might put out a pamphlet or write a book. There were things that may have called themselves journals, but worked much more like newspapers covering scientific advances, or magazines. There were proceedings of scientific societies. And all of these had different or non-existent editorial and review policies. So when you published a book, you worked directly with a publisher, right? You sent it to them. There wasn't a part where they sent it out to anonymous peer reviewers. Some of the scientific societies did something that looked kind of like peer review, but was more often done in-house or done inconsistently. Just as a snapshot in time, Einstein only ever had 1 paper that was peer reviewed. And he was so surprised and angry about it because it was so weird at the time that he pulled that paper and published it elsewhere. Science and the Journal of the American Medical Association, 2 prestigious journals, they only started what we recognize as modern peer review in the 1940s. The Lancet, which is another very prominent medical journal, didn't start until 1976. It's really only between the 60s and the 70s that this system becomes universal, even though it feels like it's been around forever. And you can see, I think, some worse histories of peer review that's like, yes, after Philosophical Transactions starts being published in the 1600s, there's peer review onward. Even that earliest journal was very inconsistent in what they did in terms of peer reviewing for a very long time. So this system that we've developed, this universal system of gatekeeping, it definitely has massive costs, and the benefits are unclear, I will argue. So the massive costs are obvious, right? Anyone who does a review knows it takes a lot of time. Our best estimate for how much time it takes is 15,000 person years of effort every year. So every year we spend a collective 15,000 years reviewing papers, which is a huge intervention, right? That's a lot of time that we spend on something, and it's totally fine to run big interventions if they have big effects, right? If I was to tell you that that I'm able to, or that my SAT tutoring intervention costs $1 trillion to run it on every student in the United States to try to increase their SAT scores. I don't know if this has any relevance in a Canadian context. Anyway, imagine I'm running a big intervention to try to increase student standardized test scores, and I tell you it's going to cost $1 trillion. You want my intervention to increase the scores by many points for $1 trillion. If it costs $10, you might be happy with 0.001 points because it's so cheap, right? We want to weigh the costs and benefits. So the costs here are obvious and large. What are the benefits? Well, one benefit of peer review is supposed to be that it catches errors in papers. So what amount of errors does it catch? This is an empirical question that we have some answers to, where people have run studies where they deliberately insert errors into papers, send it to their standard stable of peer reviewers, and then get the reviews back and just see how many of the errors that we put in did they catch. And the answer is about 25%. This is even major errors. So in one case, one of the errors that they inserted was the paper claims to be a randomized controlled trial, but if you read the methods, you will see that they didn't actually use a good method of randomization. They like randomized by days of the week. which is a huge no-no in terms of randomizing people. You're not supposed to do that. And so anybody who is taking a close look at that should catch that fact. And only about half of reviewers caught even that very obvious error in the paper. Another way of assessing how well reviewers do is just to look around and see that when we have cases of fraud, which we do often, how often does the story of that fraud being caught begin at the review stage? And I'm not saying that that never happens, but I have never seen a story of that happening. Our high-profile cases of people publishing fraudulent papers begin with them publishing the fraudulent papers, passing peer review. In my field, in social psychology, there's a huge scandal going on right now where a researcher at Harvard Business School has been accused of faking data in at least 4 papers, if not dozens. These are papers that have been out in the world for a long time. They passed peer review. And really what it seems like she did was open up an Excel document and like start moving rows around and changing numbers. Reviewers didn't catch it. And obviously they don't catch it, right? Because when a paper gets reviewed, it takes so long and so much effort to really look at the parts of the paper that are most likely to be fatal flaws, right? That most likely at the data level, and it's really hard to open up someone's data to really understand what they did. It takes a lot of time and effort. And so when I tell people this, they go, oh yeah, well, what we really need to do is get reviewers to do better. And the way that we can get them to do better is we should pay them. We should pay them for their efforts. They're obviously doing something socially useful, or at least attempting to. So what if we paid them? We've actually tried that. People have given that a good shot, and they didn't find that it made the reviews any better. And so you might think, well, what we really need to do is train the reviewers. We need to make the reviewers better at what they're doing, because no one ever gets trained on how to review something. So if we put people through a program, then that would help. They tried that too about 20 years ago. That didn't help either. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible that there's some amount that you could pay people that would make them better at reviewing. There's some amount that you could train people that would make them better at reviewing. I'm sure you could almost definitely find some effect there. I'm just pointing out that people have given an earnest effort and failed at doing this. You might also think, well, like, okay, look, I don't do a great job, but catching 25% of major errors, so that's better than nothing. To which I'd say 2 things. One, this is a really huge intervention that we're running. There's a lot of time that we're spending. The people who are spending these 15,000 years of effort every year reviewing papers, we want them to be solving important social problems, right? These are the people who are supposed to solve climate change and like cure diseases. And so if they're going to spend a lot of that time doing something else, we want it to be well spent. And so is getting 25% a good payoff for that intervention? To me, the answer is no. Your answer might be different. But certainly a downside that this has is that passing peer review can lend credibility to bad research. If we claim that we vet the studies, but we don't actually vet the studies, then we stand a chance of misleading the public. So for instance, you may recognize this paper as the famous vaccines cause autism paper called Ileal Lymphoid Modular Hypoplasia, Nonspecific Colitis, and Pervasive Developmental Disorder in Children. Basically, this is a paper in which like they followed 12 kids who got vaccines, and then like, oh, they have like a large proportion of them have autism now. Maybe vaccines cause autism. Not a great paper, but it was published in the Lancet, which has an impact factor, I think, in the top 5 of all journals. And it stayed in that journal for 12 years before it was retracted. So for 12 years, there was a paper in a very prestigious medical journal saying like, hey guys, kind of looks like vaccines cause autism. And it seems to me like that did incalculable damage to people's opinions of a vaccine that we're still paying for today. That people being skeptical of the COVID vaccine, for instance, is related in large part to this particular paper. And so we stand a chance of really damaging public trust if we tell people that they should trust this thing when we don't actually do the work required to put people's trust in it. One last way of evaluating the effects of review is to look at our indicators of scientific progress over time. If it is the case that this intervention produces an obvious improvement in the production of science, we should be able to look at these indicators over time and see some improvement, some upward trend in these lines around the time that universal peer review becomes established. Now, this isn't a perfect science, right? We don't have great measures of what makes good science, but to the extent that we do, the indicators have actually been going down in the opposite way. And I'm not saying that this is entirely due to peer review, but it at least rules out the idea that instituting this institution made some obvious positive impact. At the very best, you could only claim that it prevented an even worse downturn. But even given all that, I understand why people like the idea of this system, because in the abstract, it makes perfect sense. It makes total sense for there to be someone standing at the gate and only letting in the good ideas and keeping the bad ideas out. If such a system were possible, I too would sing its praises. But it isn't possible. There is no such thing as the omnipotent gatekeeper that can tell you which things are true and which things aren't true. Here too, I think history is a good guide. If you think about Newton, there was no gatekeeper at the time who could tell you that the Philosopher's Stone project was bad and the laws of motion project was good. The person most qualified to make that determination was Newton himself, who was the guy doing Philosopher's Stone work. So we are still in history, like we are still discovering things. We are still in a moment in time when there is something today that will eventually be the equivalent of the Philosopher's Stone, and there's something today that will be the equivalent of the laws of motion, and we don't yet have the ability to tell the difference between them. And if you're still not convinced, then I have great news about all the peer-reviewed research that you can read about in the Journal of Creation, which publishes peer-reviewed research on creationism, including articles in this issue about how the sediment record or something like that in Greenland proves, in fact, that the Earth is very young. And fortunately, it's peer-reviewed, so it's very trustworthy. This idea that gatekeeping is really difficult and it's hard to tell the difference between what's true and what's not is actually, I think, an idea that people had some knowledge of at the beginning when they started doing this gatekeeping. I was reading some history recently and found this preface to the memoirs of the Literary and Philosophical Society of Manchester from 1975. Here, when they say memoirs, they really just mean reports on what people did. They don't mean like autobiographies. So this is like an early-ish version of a scientific journal, and this is how they introduced their first issue. The sanction which the society gives to the work now published under its auspices extend only to the novelty, ingenuity, or importance of the several memoirs which it contains. Responsibility concerning the truth of facts, the soundness of reasoning, the accuracy of calculations is wholly disclaimed, and it must rest alone on the knowledge, judgment, or ability of the authors who have respectfully furnished such communications. I think this is a great disclaimer to have on any journal, because that is true. That is the level of credibility that they earn by the amount of vetting that they do, which is somewhat minimal. But look, I don't actually think that the worst excesses of scientific gatekeeping actually happen at the moment where someone lets the paper in or not, the moment that it gets accepted or rejected. I think actually the damage of this system is done when we internalize the gatekeepers. Because every scientist, as they get trained, learns how to be their own gatekeeper. And learns not to entertain any idea that could not ultimately pass peer review and be published in a journal. Some of those ideas are bad. That's why they wouldn't get passed. But some of those ideas are good. And because science is a strongman problem, I don't care actually about the bad ideas. I care about the good ideas that die in people's heads before they even get born. If we are all trying to please the gatekeepers, we're all obeying the same incentives. We're all trying to maximize our number of peer-reviewed articles in prestigious journals. What we create is a monoculture. We create a world in which we're basically all trying to be the same kind of organism. It's as if we're all trying to be, for instance, a rabbit. That like we're all going for the same niche in the world. And rabbits are fine. I love rabbits. Rabbits are great. But we can't all be rabbits. We need people obeying different incentives and trying different things and answering questions and communicating them in different ways. We don't need a world that is full of only rabbits, which will eventually collapse. What we need is an ecosystem. We need not just rabbits, but weird elephants and birds and antelope there, and that little gopher guy in the front. we need people doing different things. We need to increase the variance. That is how you solve a strong link problem. And so what I am trying to do is be another person, another organism in that ecosystem, doing something different. The worst things that I do, I expect to disappear. And if I am lucky enough to produce something worthwhile, I expect that it will last. And so my challenge to myself and my challenge to anyone else is to figure out who you are in that ecosystem and then be that way as hard as you can, because we need you. We don't need more rabbits. We need more of everything else. If you want to read more about any of this, this talk is based on these 4 posts from my blog, which you can find at experimentalhistory.com or through that QR code. And you can always send me an email at that email address. And by the way, if this idea of expanding the ecosystem appeals to you, and if you are a person or interested in being a person who does some work outside of the traditional structures of academia, I operate a Discord where these folks talk to each other, has like 120 people in it now. So you can just send me an email if you want to join that, and I'd be happy to add you. But with that, thank you so much for your time and for inviting me. And I'm happy to chat more as long as we have time.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Adam. I really enjoyed this, and I think most of the people joining did as well. So this is the part where we open it up. I would really like to hear from the students, and they have been asking questions on Slido, and they've been upvoting each other. So basically, I'm going to take a look now and just ask a couple of questions from those, and then let's see where things go from there. So just a second, I need to sort by popular. There you go. So a couple of the questions had to do with the first part of your talk, which is the Things Could Be Better article. And I think that's fair game. So maybe, we just ask some of those as well, because those are the most upvoted. Then we can get to the more meta part. So both Alyssa and Sammy asked a similar question. Alyssa asked, and feel free to jump in if you want, both Alyssa and Sammy. Otherwise, I'll read it. Looking at you, no mic. That's okay. So Alyssa asked, does it have to do with humans being inherently greedy, which causes people to always want more and thus better things? You kind of implied that earlier. And then Sammy said, can it be a natural desire for improvement, leading people to believe that things could be better in various aspects of their lives in general? So I think you already addressed that, but maybe you can just follow up again.
Yeah, greed is an interesting way of thinking about it. That like I think you could categorize some of it as greed. So like when we ask people, how could your work be different? Like or how could your finances be different? A very common response is, I could be paid more money, I could have more money. But that seems to be, I think, pretty item dependent. So when you ask people about love, they say there could be more of it. Which doesn't seem all that great. It's not that they say like, I could receive more love. And so I think there are some answers that would fall into this idea of like, I want more, but more generally, the idea seems like not just better for me, but better overall. The idea that there is a natural tendency for improvement, yes, I think that is what's going on, or a natural desire for improvement. Although it is, it's interesting that I think it takes this this form, right? Because you can improve things by preventing bad from happening, or promote things that haven't happened. Right. So like a way that a thing could be better is that you avoid it getting worse, or you like improve it in some way that like it isn't already. Those are both pathways that you could have for improving something, and it seems like people take more of the latter than the former. Which may turn out, and I would love to know if that is actually a more useful way of solving problems. That like, if you were able to like create a robot that does only one of these or only the other of these, like which one survives better? I mean, better a human than a robot, right? Like if you could program a human to do only one of these, which one does better at being a human? And it might be that the one that has a tendency toward imagining how things could be better does better. Even though it's a tendency that like, it's not even just like practical things, right? It's not like, oh, my desk could be better in that I can make it slightly more ergonomic by like raising it by 3 inches. It's like, no, my desk could be better in that it could be like made out of gold. And so it also isn't just like purely actionable things, which also makes it weird that like, is this such a good tendency that we that we don't like tamp down on the variance. And maybe it's like actually useful to generate also these wild ideas that can't happen because occasionally some of the wild ideas turn out to be useful. To that, I don't know.
Great, thank you. So Yassine asked a question that's more about the second part of the lecture, which is, isn't this gatekeeping becoming necessary because of the sheer amount of papers compared to the number of journals?
So this is a great question, an empirical one, that we have a lot of papers, fewer journals. Like, what do we do about that? I actually think that the many papers is in part caused by the fewer journals. There are extremely strong incentives in science to produce many papers and to put them in as many journals and as many prestigious journals as you can. Imagine a world in which there was not that incentive. I think actually you'd get fewer papers, right? Like I'd get no credit, or at least like before people notice, I got no credit for putting a PDF on the internet. There's no incentive for me to do that. The reason I did it was because I liked to do it. And so a lot of people who wrote to me afterward were like, well, but in a world in which everyone's just doing what they want, don't we get flooded with low quality research? I'm like, actually, I think that's the world that we're in right now. That like there are so many articles because that's what we incentivize people to do. If for any person who's obeying different incentives, I think actually you probably produce fewer papers. So now that my incentives are much more to produce the kind of things that like keep people coming back and like don't annoy people and that are useful to people, like I publish way less. And I think that would be generally true if that incentive was different. Not that I'm saying that like that's how we should design the system. I think like ideally we would have a distribution of incentives, many different incentives, and many of those I think would point to producing less and working longer on projects. And some of those would push toward producing more and working shorter on projects. And really what I want is a mix of people following those different incentives.
Thank you. So speaking of that, I'm going to transition to the part that you didn't address, but I'm assuming you're ready for. You published a very influential, popular article in Nature. Now, I know that your blog post about the rise and fall of peer review was directly inspired by this, but in a way it appears like you're having your cake and eating it too, like, which is, don't get me wrong, a good situation to be in. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about this experience, how it shaped your thinking, and what you think about that paper, how much you compromised getting it out there.
Yeah. So I should ask before I answer this question, is this going to be posted publicly?
So this is really up to you. I was going to ask you for permission. We could actually stop with the part that you just lectured on and then put that online. We don't have to put anything online. So whatever you feel comfortable with, that's what we will do.
Sure. I'm happy
to stop recording. I can stop recording right now. We've had enough.
Okay, cool. Okay, cool.